Hello, everyone. Welcome to our talk today. Today, we're going to be talking about this first clip, which will be an introduction to autism spectrum disorder and neurodiversity. And our mission here is to help communities become more autism aware. So the plan for today, in terms of this clip, we will be covering what autism spectrum disorder is and what it is not, as well as ways that you can support families and individuals who are on the spectrum. Following this training, we hope that you'll be able to identify the following things: features associated with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, common myths and misconceptions about autism spectrum disorder, and strategies to support families and individuals on the spectrum. So to start off, we can introduce ourselves. So here is a little about us. So in terms of our backgrounds, I'll go first. My name is Deandra Straighton. I'm currently a clinical psychology graduate student who specializes in autism spectrum disorder, and I'm really excited to help present the talk. Do you want to
Hi, everybody.
yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kathy Blatnick, and I have been with the Mid-Michigan Autism Association for, I think, almost 6 years, and I am the current president. And I am also a parent of a child on the autism spectrum. My son, Dominic, is 16, and he was diagnosed with autism when he was 2.5.
Awesome. And Kathy mentioned this, so I am the vice president of the Mid-Michigan Autism Association, and she is the president. And a little about our organization. We like to provide community autism spectrum disorder awareness trainings, as well as some parent workshops that we've been starting up. And so we're a really community focused organization, and we love doing talks like this. Anything you wanted to add, Kathy?
No.
Awesome. Okay, so a little bit about what Mid-Michigan Autism Association is. Our organization was founded in 2008, and it consists of a board of volunteers, which includes parents and providers in the Mid-Michigan area who wanted to better understand treatment options and local resources for families. And Kathy, do you want to talk a little bit about the next part?
Yeah, we are autism driven, so not autism specific. So what that means is a lot of times you could have Down syndrome and autism, you could have cerebral palsy and autism, basically any kind of developmental disability. And we try to service anyone, children all the way up through adults. So we never tell anybody no. Everybody is always welcome at any of our events.
Awesome. So now we'll get a little bit into the content for this first clip. So to begin with, we want to talk a little bit about what neurodevelopmental disorders are. And while we will be focusing our talk on autism spectrum disorder, many of the strategies and topics we'll talk about apply to a broad category of neurodevelopmental disorders. So we want to kind of start with that context. So neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of diagnoses related to impairments in growth and development of brain functioning. And all neurodevelopmental disorders have impairments that can cut across personal, social, academic, and or occupational functioning. Neurodevelopmental disorders often co-occur with each other because they have to do with brain development. And so often you might see an individual who has one or more of these types of disorders, and they may have lots in common even if they don't have the exact same diagnosis. So here are a list of some categories of neurodevelopmental disorders. So you can see here autism spectrum disorder and other social pragmatic communication disorders where a major component is social communication. So that ability to communicate in a social context with other people is a challenge in those situations. Another category would be attention and concentration disorders. So things like ADHD would fall here. Another category of neurodevelopmental disorders would be intellectual, developmental, and language disorders. Those are also neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as learning disorders such as specific learning disorders in math or reading or dyslexia. And then another category is the category of motor coordination or movement and tic disorders. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's just an example of some of these neurodevelopmental conditions that all have to do with brain development. There are also high levels of co-occurrence between all of these different neurodevelopmental disorders and other conditions. So this can be a very complex picture. Often similar social, emotional, and behavioral challenges can occur across these disorders. So the question isn't always whether an individual has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but what is their unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses? What are their needs? These are some examples of other conditions that may co-occur with autism spectrum disorder, or really any of the neurodevelopmental disorders. So you can see here sleep and feeding issues, GI sensitivities, sort of in the gut, behavior and emotion regulation issues, mood and anxiety disorders. That would also include things like depression, genetic and other medical conditions, and then also seizures and epilepsy. These are some examples. And Kathy, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, my son Dominic, he was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 3, and epilepsy about, I think, almost 6 years ago, and then anxiety disorder too. So he, in addition to autism, he has 3 other things going on. So it's very common.
Awesome. Yeah, these are really common. And so again, you really want to be thinking about the individual person and sort of what are their strengths and challenges, and what are the needs that they need to have some support with. And also, what are their strengths? Okay, so a little bit more specifically about autism spectrum disorder, or ASD for short. So ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by challenges with social communication and interaction, as well as restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviors and interests. So what does that actually mean? Well, here you can see in terms of social communication challenges, this is the ability for someone to comfortably communicate in a social context, either with verbal or nonverbal ways of communicating. So some examples of challenges with social communication include difficulty initiating or sustaining a conversation, challenges with body language, gestures, and facial expressions in a social context. And then there may be some differences in how individuals on the spectrum connect with others. That's not to say that they don't connect or don't enjoy social time, but they may just do it in a different way. Anything you want to add there, Kathy?
I think the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest ones, is the social communication, that they're not able to kind of have that back and forth. Some individuals on the spectrum can, and others can't. So it's a challenge. It can be a very, very big challenge for those with autism.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later too, but we do call it autism spectrum disorder because there's a wide spectrum of needs and supports that people may need. So like Kathy said, some people may need more support with social communication than others, but the basic idea is if you have a diagnosis of ASD, you do have challenges in that area. It might just look different from person to person in terms of how much support you might need. Awesome. The next piece to kind of investigate further would be restricted and repetitive interests. So some examples of challenges with restricted and repetitive interests would include difficulty with unpredictable situations or changes in routines that can really feel disorienting and uncomfortable for someone. Also potentially unusual or intense interests. So when we say that, we mean interests that might be really intense in their focus. So, like maybe someone likes baseball, which is a pretty common interest, but is very intense in their focus on baseball. Or it might also be sort of a more atypical focus on like maybe a specific part of something. So maybe an individual might be very particularly interested in the types of tires of certain cars. That's what we mean by these types of interests. And some people will refer to these as special interests, and they're often a source of happiness and excitement for individuals on the spectrum. And it's a really nice way to connect with folks to kind of understand their interests. Um, we also might see repetitive motor movements or language use here. So this might be repetitive body movements like hand flapping or rocking back and forth, or repetitive language use, like saying the same kinds of phrases or passages over and over, or repeating back what someone else just said. And again, a lot of times these behaviors and interests are done for self-soothing reasons. So they feel comfortable and might make the person feel um, more engaged and like regulated with their emotions. So um, that's often when we see these things happening. Anything you want to add there, Kathy?
Yeah, a lot of individuals on the spectrum, my son included, they do something called scripting. So it's basically what it sounds like. Dominic has watched different like Barney episodes, Thomas the Train, and he will literally do the whole video from the beginning to the end. And it's usually when he's under or either understimulated or overstimulated. Lately, it's overstimulated. So if, sometimes people will kind of look at him and wonder why it sounds like he's talking to himself. But if you listen really closely, it's usually scripting from Thomas or Barney or something that he's watched in the past. And it kind of is like a comforting, kind of like you have your favorite blanket. For him, saying those same words over and over again kind of brings him a lot of comfort.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that is a really nice example of some of what we're talking about here and the comforting aspect of that stuff. Thanks. Okay. And then another piece to this would be sensory sensitivities and interests are often seen with individuals on the spectrum. So we often see sensory seeking behaviors such as maybe wanting deep pressure or really exploring maybe like the texture of the carpet or a lampshade or something like that, really seeking out sensory experiences. But we also might see sensory aversion, which would be avoiding or trying to escape certain sensory experiences that may feel overwhelming. So you might see that when someone is experiencing like moderate or loud noise might be very overwhelming for that person, or maybe flashing lights might be, or something too bright might be really overwhelming, these sorts of things. We also see sometimes that there is a lack of response to certain sensory experiences. So something like that might kind of alert you, or a typically developing person might not have the same response for someone on the spectrum. So for example, if you stubbed your toe, you'd probably, you might like hurt your toe and be kind of like hopping, like, ow, those sorts of things. Sometimes certain sensory experiences like that may or may not get that response from someone on the spectrum because they kind of have different experiences of sensory input. Anything you want to add there, Kathy?
Our treasurer, who has been with our organization almost since the very beginning, she's told us the story of her son, who I think is now 30. When he was younger, he broke his arm, but he wasn't able to have the language or wasn't able to tell anybody that he was in pain. And he actually had more issues with them trying to, I think, put the IV in. He was walking around with a broken arm, but just getting that IV put into his vein was more traumatic than having a broken arm. So they do, you can be hypo or hypersensitivity, have those sensitivities, sensory, hyposensitive or hypersensitive. So
Mm-hmm.
either you feel pain very acutely or else you don't really feel pain at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a wide range.
Yep, exactly. And so for all of these things, including the sensory stuff and the social communication stuff and the restricted and repetitive interests, all these things can look very different from person to person, and also even like from situation to situation in the same person. So you can really see a range of this stuff. Great. So here I just wanted to kind of illustrate how all these things can sort of play into each other. So you can imagine if you're having challenges with social communication and sort of like communicating with others socially. And then also you might be exhibiting some of these repetitive behaviors or maybe like insistence on sameness and having a hard time with changes in routines or unpredictable things. And then also having the sensory sensitivities. This can all lead to someone having a lot of social and emotional and behavioral challenges, right? Because if you're having challenges across these three areas, it can be very overwhelming for someone to kind of regulate their own emotions or their own behavior, but also to really engage with people socially if you're kind of feeling overwhelmed from lots of different pieces of these things. Okay, so the next part is going to kind of walk us through how these things might come up in your interactions with neurodiverse individuals. So to start off with, again, we really need to think about the individual person as a whole. So the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis may not be the only thing that we need to be thinking about with that person, and it probably isn't the only thing. We want to think about, are they feeling anxious? Are they prone to seizures? Are they, um, you know, able to sort of communicate with us what their needs are? Do they have the tools they need to do that? These sorts of things. We also want to think about how individuals may become very overwhelmed and sort of have more difficulty regulating themselves. And so we might see tantrums or meltdowns or these sorts of behaviors. And they're almost always because someone is feeling overwhelmed. And so we kind of have to be detectives to figure out what's going on in this setting that's making that person feel overwhelmed and how can we sort of reduce that stress for them. Because these kinds of meltdowns or tantrums are almost always because someone is feeling overwhelmed. Another piece of this is challenges getting needed information. If you have a hard time communicating socially with other people, it can be really hard to let people know what you need or what you want in a situation. And so that can be, again, really stressful for someone. And it can also get in the way of them getting the care that they need or the service that they need or whatever it might be in your setting. We also want to pay attention to everyone's sensory sensitivities and aversions. Some people may seek out certain experiences that are, sensory related in your space. Some people may feel really overwhelmed by certain sensory experiences in your space. And so just keeping those things in mind, and we'll talk about later, thinking through like some ways that you can build in spaces within your setting that can help a person feel more regulated. So for example, a quiet space with dimmer lighting might be a nice area for someone if they are starting to feel really overwhelmed by the sensory input to be able to go to in that situation in your setting. And then another piece of this is, in your interactions, you may find that people are resisting help or that they may sort of not be, other people may be interfering with the situation, or the person may be interfering with the way you typically provide services or care. And again, this is often because that person is feeling really overwhelmed, and we need to sort of do some detective work and figure out what's making that person overwhelmed and how can we be most helpful in that situation. There are lots of other ways that these things can come up in your interactions in various different spaces. So that's what sort of those question marks mean there. Anything you want to add, Kathy? No. Okay. So to illustrate the sensory sensitivity piece, there is a really lovely video on YouTube that we like to show at this point. So we are going to link that video in the description of this clip. So if you are able, we really recommend you clicking that link and watching that video because it will really help illustrate what it might feel like to have a lot of these sensory sensitivities in a community. And we did want to just put a little disclaimer here that the video that is in the link will include flashing graphics and loud noises. And so if you are a person who has sensory sensitivities, that might be disruptive to you. And just be aware of that if you're going to go ahead and click that link. Okay, I think that is the end of this section. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Kathy?
Nope, I think you're good.
Awesome. Okay, we'll come back for part 2.